Welcome to Funny They Don't Look Jewish, where Judaism appears in the panels. Our purpose is to find characters, stories, and issues of comics that explore explicitly Jewish content. I'm Brandon Bernstein.
I'm Henry Bernstein.
No relation. And we're back. Henry, how are you doing tonight?
Doing great. Excited to get into my world, the world of DC Comics.
Yeah, we've been spending some time. We were over in Marvel for the past couple episodes, and we are diving right in. Enough with the chit-chat, enough with the intro and the checking in. We need people to know that this is a DC Comics podcast right now.
It's funny. I'm sure there's some maybe more equity than I think of when we cover Marvel versus DC, but maybe not. Maybe we do overwhelmingly cover Marvel. I don't know. I haven't looked back at those analytics don't come up when I'm checking the podcast statistics.
I feel like when we go back and forth, it's fairly even. The problem was that like 3 Shy of a Minion episode where I think we covered all Marvel characters and there weren't any DC. So I think that gave that, but it was such small content. Who knows? Anyway, we're back. We're so excited to have you with us. And we just couldn't get enough of that lovable, hulking clump of clay that we call the Golem. So we're back with more Golem content.
Yay, but this time the distinguished competition.
Yes, the distinguished competition of the Marvel Golem in the form of the DC Golem. Now, if you've been listening to us for a while, you may be saying to yourselves, wait a minute, we've covered Golems in DC before. And you're right. Way back in episodes 15 and 16, our episodes featuring Ragman, part of the Israeli superhero team, the Hayoth, you may recall that one of the members there was a guy known as Golem. So those are in issues of Suicide Squad and the Spectre, but that's not the Golem we're talking about. That's a completely separate character. Henry, who else are we not talking about?
We're also not talking about another Golem who has been dubbed Golem II, which first appeared in Ragman #2. Now, we covered this Golem as well in episode 7. And so if you ever want to go back and check it out, you can check out more Golem content from episodes 15 and 16, as Brandon mentioned, or episode 7. Also, there's a Golem in Batman 551 covered in episode 8. So we really have already visited the Golem of DC.
Yeah, well, Golems, multiple, right? There's 3 different Golems because you've got the Suicide Squad, you've got the Ragman Golem, and then you have the Batman issue was like the Golem of actual Jewish legend, or as we learned from Gershom Scholem, questionably pieced together legend.
Right.
But Henry, I don't remember if I told you this, but it's kind of wild. It turns out the Golem from Ragman actually went on to reappear just like a year or 2 later in the Ragman Cry of the Dead series. And I don't know if it's because it was popular or what, but it ended up being a main character in a 0-hour series called Primal Force, where Golem goes on to become a main character of that team. But I didn't read every issue, but I flipped through them looking, and there appears to be almost 0 Jewish content. But fun things that happened are the Golem decides to name itself. I think it calls itself Paul. Decides Paul's a nice Jewish Golem name. And when it dies at the end of Primal Force, and when it gets resurrected and comes back, it has the word truth on its forehead. Now, this is unlike in a lot of the comics where it's the English letters of EMETH or EMES. No, the English word truth, TRUTH, is on its forehead. So they clearly didn't quite get it.
I don't know. I kind of like that more because it's a little more truthful than MF in English letters. At least is the thing that it means.
No, we are having a machloket, my friend. I am not in agreement about this. Because the whole point is that it's not just that it's language, but that the Hebrew language within the mythology of Judaism, like the Hebrew language has the ability to create it, specifically those Hebrew letters. So English being truth does nothing. You wrote truth in the forehead. The only thing you should be making is either Superman or Captain America.
Right. I remember when Primal Force came out. 0 Hour was big for me. That was like 1994. Superman had just returned from the dead, long hair. Hal Jordan had just gone evil and was the villain. Like, big things were happening at DC. This was a very important, this kind of fixed some of the timeline discrepancies of Crisis on Infinite Earths. That was its intention. And they had also introduced all these other young comics of like young heroes. And this is one of those things where I definitely got all the Zero issues for like the main guys, like the A
Yeah,
level
well,
guys, but I
because
didn't
when
get
you're
Zero.
like,
I didn't get Primal Force number 0.
right, but when you're 10 years old, right, what's cooler than issue 0?
Right.
Whoa.
I mean, it was really cool.
Yeah, of course. I get it. Wait, was Zero Hour one of those series where they did the countdown chronology? So it was like issue 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 in the main series, or am I mixing it up with other things?
Yes. The main
Okay,
series started with issue number 4 and went
nice.
down to 0. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
the
But like,
0 issue is just a blank cover. And it was like the
yeah,
first time
so
that had been done. Then they started doing it as a marketing thing for like going
yeah,
to signees. But I got at a con, and then I promise we'll move on. When I met Dan Jurgens, I got him to draw a Superman symbol on the blank cover of 0 Hour number 0 because he and Jerry Ordway drew and wrote it. Talk about a Henry dream team, right?
amazing, amazing. I love also the idea that like so many people probably asked for the drawings on it that it started the more modern marketing trend
Right.
of purposely blank covers so that you
Oh, for
could get
sure.
artists to draw on them at conventions. Anyway, the final Golem that we are not talking about is we had Golem and Golem 2, and now get ready, Golem 3, who appeared, as far as I know, only in one issue in May 1999 in JSA Returns, Thrilling Comics #1. So part of the '90s throwback to the golden age sort of comics. This Golem is a villain. Appears by the name of Golem and seemingly has no Jewish content, hence the reason that we're not covering him.
He's just like Clayface of Jace.
Just Clayface of Jace, for sure. Speaking of Clayface of Jace, we are going to be turning for this episode into the world of the Batman.
Yes!
We're looking at a two-part of Detective Comics 631 and 632. Henry, why don't you take us into the first issue?
Right, so we're talking about Detective Comics number 631, July 1991, The Golem of Gotham, Part 1. Written by Peter Milligan, penciled by Jim Aparo, inked by Mike DiCarlo, colored by Adrian Roy, lettered by John Costanza, edited by Denny O'Neil, and Kelly Puckett. One thing you should know about me, Brandon, and I don't know if anyone else cares, but we talked in the past about Dan Jurgens and Jerry Ordway, those are like my Superman guys.
Yeah.
Jim Aparo's Batman is my Batman. That's like Nightfall Batman. That's, going all the way back to the 80s. Like, that's how I picture Batman. So I was just like licking my chops when I read this comic.
That is fantastic. I get excited just because for me, Peter Milligan will always be that cool Vertigo or DC guy that came over to Marvel and wrote the Celebrity Culture X-Force series, which I have so much love for, right? Came X-Statics. So whenever I see Peter Milligan, I'm always like, ooh, that's an author to look at. Like, I was kind of surprised that he was writing as early as 1991. It makes sense, but it's like, I really knew him from 2001 on. So this is like, it was cool for me to go and see what he was doing a decade earlier than I first met him.
It's awesome. I mean, yeah, it's great. I mean, one thing I always comment on the cover of these when we talk about them, and it's a nondescript cover. There's nothing on it or in the other issues, spoiler alert, that have anything to do with the Golem of Gotham that would indicate. Usually, like, you're used to seeing covers that have nothing to do with what's inside when it's like they show you something that actually isn't going to happen on the cover, but it at least has something to do with the story. This just looks like it's a cool detective comic shot of like Batman beating up some thugs. Like, so my question to you is, why? Why do you think that for this, it's not Jim Aparo? Why do you think these two issues, that is a pretty well-known story already at this point in literature and movies and comics, why do you think there's nothing on the cover with the Golem?
Well, I would guess, spoiler alert for the end of this issue, but it's kind of like a mystery reveal of who the villain is at the end of this issue, at least. So
okay,
they're kind of keeping that secret, and obviously we read it, we know for sure it's a Golem and it's pretty obvious, but maybe they just didn't want to give it away. Maybe they're just in a mode of like, what sells covers? Batman beating up thugs. We want Batman beating up thugs on every cover we got.
Right. I mean, literally, this is Batmania. This is after Batman 89 and right before Batman Returns. This is like the height of Batmania. So, yeah.
Yeah, so this comic's just emphasizing the Batman everywhere you can.
Okay, I'll accept that. I like that.
Nice. The other thing I want to say, the title, I love it. The Golem of Gotham. You may recall that when we covered in the Marvel series, the 4 issue had the Golem of Yancey Street. So I love the fact that in comics we've just got this tradition. There's like, there's the Golem of Prague and the Golem of Gotham and the Golem of Yancey Street, and maybe one day we'll find a Golem of Metropolis. But I just love it.
How about Golem League issue number 1?
Oh my God, Golem League International.
Yeah, yeah, but at least this one has alliteration, so this might be the best one.
This might be the best one, although we're starting on page 1 with something that I would definitely not say is the best, that being white supremacy and racism. We start off immediately with a depiction of masked figures breaking the glass of a storefront that clearly has the label Patel on it. So we've got these white supremacists attacking Indian immigrants, essentially, and it's intercut with an image of a Nazi officer breaking the window of a store called, it looks like Goldshim's. Which is clearly a Jewish store. And we get narration to a man named Jacob in panic, commenting that it's happening again. It's happening again. The night of crystals, which, for us reading, we immediately are like, oh, are they trying to say Kristallnacht? That's an interesting way to call it, like the night of broken glass. But you're like, there's very clearly a Kristallnacht allegory being drawn.
But is the narrator Jacob, or is he talking to this?
He's talking to Jacob.
Man, yeah.
So on page 2, we are going to see this old bearded man who looks pretty Jewish moving away from the explosion. And we're not going to learn this until much later, I think, actually in part 2, but it's going to be easier. There's a guy named Saul Zweimer. So Saul is our narrator, and Saul in his narration keeps referencing a guy named Jacob, who we're going to learn more about. On page 3, the narration actually identifies it as Kristallnacht. Saul thinks about the fact that he's remembering Kristallnacht. Batman saves the storefront, and then later is talking to Alfred and identifies the fact that these attacks are in East Hamilton, a district of Gotham City. And he says East Ham's been home for generations of immigrants. For a long time, it was mainly Jews. Recently, there's been an influx of people from the Indian subcontinent, which just to me, Henry, it struck me as like very lifelike. I know on the Lower East Side in different neighborhoods, like this happens in Canada. I have a lot of family in and around Toronto, and it feels like in a lot of these cities and suburbs, there are these neighborhoods that have a lot of Jewish immigrants, and then the Jewish immigrants end up finding success and kind of moving like often north or uptown, and then other immigrants end up coming into the same neighborhoods. But like it's kind of cool that it's acknowledging like East Ham also, I'm imagining, is sort of Gotham's version of the Lower East Side, which also famously had a lot of Jewish immigrants. But yeah, I don't know. Any thoughts, or should we keep going?
No, just that, like that's true in Chicago too. Like, that, so right. I also related to that. Yeah, very much so. I mean, this was one of those moments. We're gonna have plenty of nice things to say about this, but this was one of those moments where I was like, oh, nice touch. It was kind of like, reading Paul Kupperberg's Supergirl. I was like, that's some good, like when it makes sense and feels familiar and explicitly Jewish. Like Batman literally says that it was mainly Jewish. Like, right, exactly. If Batman says it's Jewish, I'm trusting Batman.
Right. He knows the city inside and out. I also love the comparison and showing like, okay, it happened to the Jews in Germany and now it's happening to these Indian immigrants here. And so it's sort of the anti-Semitism as being similar to other forms of racism or hate, right, that exists in one way or another, right? Like the parallels are very clear immediately.
Absolutely.
On page 4, we once again see Saul, our bearded and kippah-clad man, and he's recalling previously carrying sacks of clay through the streets of München in Germany 50 years ago, in 1940, roughly. Then this comic came out in 91. And he's commenting in this narration to Jacob, "It was I who considered myself the mystic, the decoder of the terrible mysteries of the Kabbalah and the Book of Yetzirah, which like is both accurate, but I always love the way people talk of it like the Kabbalah as though it's this one large body of literature as opposed to like an entire sort of way of interpreting like
it's like an omnibus.
yeah, it's like they talk about the Kabbalah as though it's just a book you could read or the system when
not
it's
a subject.
So right, but it's like such a subject and there's so many different sort of like takes and so many different Kabbalistic works. I also love calling it the Book of Yetzirah, which it's a reference to Sefer Yetzirah, which literally means the Book of Creation. And I'm used to it being one language or another. It's either the Book of Creation or Sefer Yetzirah. It's really weird to call it the Book of Yetzirah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, you're right. There was like when I read it like obviously I knew what they were talking about, but it didn't sound quite right. That's right. That's funny.
I think he's obviously Milligan is trying to be like, yeah, Yetzirah, it gives us this exotic feel. It sounds so cool and mystical when you call it that. But I guess he just thought like calling it Sefer Yetzirah would be like a step too far. So it had to be the Book of Yetzirah for the readers.
How often when we've seen the Golem stuff so far, how often do you think they've referred to just the Kabbalah to a specific to like the Zohar or to Sefer Yetzirah? Like we haven't seen Sefer Yetzirah yet, have we? I mean, we've seen the Zohar somewhere.
We saw we never see Zohar in relationship to the Golem. So from what I remember,
right. No, I know.
There was a Moon Knight villain named Zohar, weirdly enough, as you might remember.
That's true, of course.
Yeah, usually, I mean, it's a lot of references to the ambiguous, the Kabbalah. We've definitely had a reference to Sefer Yetzirah before, or the Book of Creation. I forget which Golem story it was, but like, it's definitely been referenced in a comic. I'd have to look it up later to see. So this time Saul is determined to actually make a golem. The implication being he tried it once, it didn't work, but this time he's going to succeed. And so on page 5, as Saul continues in his memory and his narration, he indicates that this is going to take all night as, quote, God holds his breath in outrage, which is just like Milligan's bringing the poetic dialogue at this point. In fact, I want to read the whole thing. Like, you know, we have this beautiful image of Saul in a styling purple suit, holding what looks like a volume of 2-columned work. I guess it's some Kabbalistic. I guess that's Sefer Yetzirah in the way he's holding it. Right. I do find it a little weird. It has the ribbon bookmark, which I don't usually see in Sforim. I guess they could, but
I feel like in like the Koran Siddur has 2 of them.
Yeah.
I feel like in like Sirius Sfarim.
Sure, they could have. Yeah, all right.
Like in a Mikro Gedolot Chumash. I know we're really getting into the weeds here, but like,
sure,
which is, you know, like a Bible that has all of the commentators in it.
You're right, and I'm even just looking on my shelf right now, and I can see a Schottenstein Talmud, and there's a ribbon inside that. So, like, all right, I take it back.
Take back your ribbon slander.
All right, look, I'm just so used to the art doing us dirty, Henry.
Right, I know. So I know we're so like at this point we're so nitpicky on that menorah only had 4 branches. What the hell?
Yeah, absolutely. But we have this beautiful narration. It takes all night, or perhaps many nights, or perhaps this night stands still, as though God holds his breath in outrage. I love the concept of who knows how much time is passing. I love the idea that he's so focused on his work. And I love this implication of like the golem as a tool of God's vengeance, right? Like that God's outraged over what's going on. And it's like, you know, God kind of slow to act, but ultimately bringing terrible vengeance. And so Saul's holding the book and he indicates in the narration, I circle my creation around and around, reciting the 221 combinations of the alphabet derived from the Book of Yetzirah, the Book of Creation. I have not done the math, but that sounds right to me, that 221 is the number of combinations. Like in Sefer Yetzirah, it goes into the idea that you basically recite each letter of the alphabet in conjunction with letters of God's name, the Tetragrammaton, and with different like vowel sounds, right? So if you were starting with the Aleph, it would be like E, O, U, right? Like you just like go through and are doing that in like all the different combinations that are possible. So the idea of like going through literally every letter of the alphabet with every possible vowel combination with all the letters of God's name, like the idea is that's the secret to creation. That sounds right to me from what I recall. Listeners, if any of you is a Sefer Yetzirah scholar, feel free to tell me how very wrong I am. That's my memory. And Saul here reflects on his...
Wait, before you go on to with Saul, I just had a thought. Every time you say the Tetragrammaton, which is, you've said it a bunch.
Yeah.
It's such a cool comic book word. Like it sounds like the secret base of a supervillain team. Like in my mind, I picture the Krang and Shredder's
the
Technodrome for some reason.
So
that's what
funny.
My mind goes to when I hear you say that. So I'm just giving a pitch, like a free, cool name to any comic creator out there. It's right there.
It's right there happening. It's so funny. I love that term mostly. Like when I first encountered it was in this short story, believe it or not in the Jewish world, but a short story by Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian author. He has this story called Death in the Compass, which I'm just going to give a quick pitch for the story because it's so cool. It's following this like detective who is solving a series of murders. And as he goes on, he discovers at the scene of every crime of these murders, it's these rabbis are being murdered. And every time a rabbi is murdered, there's a note that says like, the first letter of the Tetragrammaton has been revealed. The second letter of the Tetragrammaton has been revealed. And I just remember reading it as this college student, being like, why is there these Jewish secrets in this Borges story? It was the coolest thing. And it's just influenced, like, I just love the term Tetragrammaton, whether it is for a Ninja Turtles base or the name of God. From the holy to the mundane.
Which one's which?
I'll leave that to our listeners to decide. But Saul, as he's doing his work, he's reflecting also on his past desire. He wanted to make a golem to protect Jacob and other Jews from the Nazis. His friend Jacob thought that it would be better to make guns, which it feels to me very like the typical sort of Zionist versus religious Jew debate, right? Like, do we rely upon the old ways and old traditions, or do we take matters into our own hands? It feels very, right? Like this like armed resistance, this idea of like fighting back versus, I mean, they're both looking to fight back, but I love the idea that Saul's like, I know what protects Jews. Golems protect Jews. And then I'm trying to remember, there was some comic I heard once where it was like, I don't remember what it's from, but there was some joke where someone gets shot and goes, oh, bullets, my only weakness. How did you know?
Bullets, my only weakness. How did you know?
Yeah, exactly. Because it's like, that's how I feel, right? Because like Saul is like this mystical protector and Jacob's like, how about guns? Guns are effective.
Right.
No. So we flash back and we see who we can only assume to be a younger Saul and Jacob at roughly 23 years old. They're looking at this failed clay. It's clinging to like a half life. You can't tell if it's like a shadowy figure trying to rise up or like a hand like bubbling. The
it's
art
kind of
so
horrific.
It's very horrific. As a guy into horror, I'm loving that channel.
Because
like
you also can't tell not only if it's like a body coming to life or a hand, but like it also could be a body melting, like their failed experiment. Because look at them,
absolutely,
like they look so worried and sad. It's great. I mean, Jim Afaro, man.
Yeah, and like you see behind them, you see just this like framed picture of a Magen David, which like on the one hand, like kind of boring art, and on the other hand, literally as I'm looking up right now, I see my psychedelic image of a Magen David that I bought in Spot. So like maybe it's meant to be a fancier version than what we see depicted.
Maybe kind of gotta give it up to Jacob and Saul for having a framed Magen David during the Holocaust.
Yeah. They're they're not afraid of who they are, I suppose. So as Saul continues, I intone permutations of each letter of the alphabets with each consonant of the Tetragrammaton. So exactly as I was describing earlier. On page 6, we continue with a flashback. It's 1937. It's Kristallnacht. And Jacob and Saul are watching as the Nazis attack, and Saul reflects that he was quiet. He didn't do anything. He didn't step up to stop them from destroying synagogues or to arrest the Jews. And then it's heartbreaking. Saul shares with us that he was also quiet as he saw them carry Jacob and all of Jacob's resistance fighters away. And he never saw Jacob again. So you get the sense that this is a man haunted by the fact that he took his inaction, right? His inability to act in 1940 has haunted him for over 50 years now.
Right.
We're going to learn a little bit later that there's a little bit more to what he's sharing with us. But this time, Saul is determined to succeed. And so he says, with my index finger, I inscribe the word Emeth onto its forehead. Emeth, truth. And even as my finger traces the final consonant, I can feel the golem beginning to stir. Milligan's really good with narration, Henry.
I know, he's a really good writer. I mean, so far, nothing feels even the slightest gratuitous or exploitive of like this story, or or Jews or whatever. It seems very tasteful and well written.
Henry, you're more familiar with, like, I've read a lot of famous Batman stories, but especially early 90s or earlier. I never read the like weekly Detective Comics and Batman series. Like, is this common to have an issue that's spending so much time building up a side character?
Yeah.
And it's almost like Batman's sort of like Batman is the minor character in his own book, sort of.
This is pretty typical for the time of like really good Batman stories. Remember, like Denny O'Neil is writing at times, and like this is Graham Nolan.
It reminds me I love Neil Gaiman's Sandman, and it reminds me of some Sandman issues where basically you would just follow this other character for the overwhelming majority of the story, and Sandman would just kind of appear on the edges or at the end to be the impactful player.
Right.
But like, I'm loving it because this two-parter is basically Saul's story more than it is Batman's.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole story is Saul's story. It's great. I mean, this was sort of typical for the time in terms of like great storytelling. Like, this is all across comics. I think that's why we think of the 90s. Obviously there's like very 90s things happening, but for like
the late 90s, not so great. Early 90s, a lot 90s, of good stuff.
Right. 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 And they also cared about storylines going from over multiple issues. Like, they had big ideas and big character arcs, not so much in this case in Batman. This is a two-parter, but I don't know, there just seemed to be a care that I wouldn't say isn't there now, but doesn't make me feel something. I don't know. Maybe it's just because like when you read comics at 8, 9, and 10 and 11, like that's just kind of like what they say about like your favorite music is when you were in high school. It's just like,
no, but like because when I go back and read early 90s comics I never read as a kid, they strike me as different than a lot of modern stuff. I think part of it is just the fact that in a post-Ultimates world, by which I mean after the Ultimate Universe at Marvel, which really happened around, 2000, 2001, like in the world of what they often would call like widescreen comic books, right?
Yeah,
and those big ones. So like the cinematic stuff, so much the art takes center stage and it's gorgeous, but as a result, it just became less in vogue to have the detailed narrative captions. And when you don't have the narration, you're missing it. Like, part of what I think is so rich about this is the fact that like the narration is not describing the art. It is adding to the art by really getting into the mindset of what's going on. And we just don't see that as much, right? Comics these days are a lot more like the necessary description of what's going on, and then otherwise like dialogue, but you don't really see the narration. There's omniscient narrators aren't as common. And so,
right.
Yeah. Anyway, that tangent aside, on page 10, we check in with Batman, who's chasing down some of those white supremacist punks that had just set an Indian temple on fire, which was like devastating to see. And Batman finds one of these white supremacists is dead, and he's got a twisted neck with clay marks on the neck, and Batman's shocked. Now, you joked about this earlier, Henry, but I realized part of the fun is like, if you didn't know what was going on, would you not assume with the clay there that it's Clayface as the villain?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to say something at the end about that too.
Yeah.
But I read this at the time. And again, we've talked about this now a million times. Like, I remember thinking it was cool, but it didn't stay with me until I reread it as an adult. And this was one of the things, Brandon, this was one of the comics, I don't know if you remember this, that sort of early on when I was like kicking around this idea with you of doing this podcast, I sent to you like way early. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah,
but,
I do. It's wild that we've known we were going to cover this comic for like 6 years and have only gotten to it now.
Yeah, but I guess I would have thought it was Clayface, but this is a cool. If you know, you know, and if you don't, it doesn't matter. Like, this is great. Like, if you're watching and paying attention, so if you know the villain Clayface and you see that reference, you're like, oh, sweet, it's going to be Clayface. This is a Clayface issue. But if you don't know about Clayface, it's still just mysterious and interesting. And if you read the title that said Golem, you know it's going to be a Golem. So it just sort of works in all the ways. That's, again, good writing.
Love it. Love it. On page 12, the Golem.
One more thing. Like, Batman here in his journal, which I love when the narration is Batman's personal journal, like his war journal, he could have said, could it be Clayface?
Right.
But he just leaves it as Clay, because Batman is a detective and he's not going to jump to any conclusions just because he's used to Clayface. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the reason. So I love that, like, even that attention to detail of like getting into the Batman psyche there, into his own journal, is just mwah.
So cool. So cool. On page 12, the Golem, who, by the way, has not fully been revealed. We know that Saul is trying to create one, but he's still covered. He's still in shadow. He's basically in like a trench coat and fedora. The Golem brings Saul to a cemetery that turns out to be a Jewish cemetery, and the same gang of neo-Nazis has painted swastikas on all the graves, which, like, devastating to see. On page 13, Saul reveals himself, and the neo-Nazis call him Jaime, as an insult, of course. And I think we've talked about that before, right? Like Jaime being used as a derogative term for Jews. And they ask Saul, like, why are you even here? And Saul goes, this is a Jewish cemetery. I am a Jew. I am visiting those with whom I shall very shortly lie. There's something about it's so Ashkenazi old man coded, obviously. Like, it very well works. And like, I could hear him saying that. I know the types of Jews that speak that way. I love it.
Right. He even does ask a question at the end, but I'm surprised he didn't even phrase that as a question. Like, this is a Jewish cemetery. I am a Jew. Should I not be here honoring the dead with whom I'm going to lie?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, part of Saul's confidence comes from his cloaked figure and friend, who on page 14 approaches. The neo-Nazis have threatened Saul, and then the Golem comes by. And Saul wonders in his own narration, is it so bad that he's enjoying their fear this much, that he doesn't feel wrong about what's going to happen? And like, you can kind of understand, like, this is a power fantasy for him. He survived the Holocaust. He saw the Nazis rise to power. He experienced this, and he knows that he didn't act, and now he has a protector, and he's like reveling in it. And I get it, Saul. So the Golem attacks. We're going to skip forward to page 18, where after the attack, Saul is letting the Golem know that he's disappointed because the Golem didn't listen to him, and he created the Golem. The Golem should be listening. I told you not to chase the other one. He looked scared and contrite. The point was to let him tell his friends that the ghetto now has a terrible protector. In other words, he's upset about the fact that, like, we weren't there to just kill them and take vengeance. The whole point was to let the word get out about you so that they stop doing these crimes. And Saul gets Saul, on the one hand, good morality, because he's saying we shouldn't just kill them. On the other hand, he's got quite the temper, because he's like, Saul asked the Golem, why'd you leave the marks up? Why didn't you erase the swastikas from the stones? And he's so upset about it that he threatens to wipe the E from MF off the forehead, which, to those of us who know the Golem story, know that would lead meth or met or death. And then the Golem smacks Saul back. The sassy little Golem, the sassy big Golem. Saul is shook, and this should not happen. He's going crazy, Jacob. Ganz verrückt. So now Saul is not only narrating to Jacob, but he's like talking out loud, which also we're getting to a point where it's like, is Saul all there? Is he like in reality? He's like living in the past and the present at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
The golem goes off attacking an innocent couple in the street because the golem thinks that the couple are Nazis, right? As Saul's sort of feverish flashbacks are affecting the golem also, it seems. And then finally on page 22, as Batman gets in to save this innocent couple, or to help the woman at least, because the man has been killed, we finally get the cloak removed and see the golem made of clay in this grotesque, rough, hairstyle wise, he kind of reminds me of either one of the Osborns from Spider-Man or like the Sandman.
Right, the sort of Brillo pad of hair.
Yes, yeah, exactly. But we've got this like gross clay golem scowling at Batman with Emeth written on his forehead, all in lowercase letters.
Yeah, and on the page before, Batman, when the reveal of Batman seeing it, Batman's horrified. He's
right.
Like, my God.
Yeah.
And just that a great Jim Aparo sort of stretched out, shocked Batman look. And then the reveal on the last page. I mean, that's just like perfect comic book storytelling. Like if I could, and I do, I would give someone an example of a great comic. This would be, I'm like going to put this on my list of like when someone says to me, like, I'm thinking of getting into comic books, or my child is, my teenager's into comic books, you know, like, what should I start with? Like, I'm going to like put this on there. It's just a good comic book.
It's got solid stuff. Henry, what do you think? We've now seen quite a lot. Like we were just looking back in those Batman issues that we covered in the Ragman episodes. There was like an image of a golem that kind of looked like this misshapen blob thing, like
smooth golem
or smooth golem. Yeah. And then we saw right in the Marvel flashbacks there was the giant stone golem that kind of looked like a stone warrior, right? Mm-hmm. What do you think of this grotesque clay golem in this comic? Like how's he ranked compared to the others we've seen?
I really don't want to just have recency bias or Batman bias, but I think this is my favorite because the like giant one in the sort of leotard and short shorts and belt, it was cool looking as its own ridiculous looking thing. But like, if I was thinking, and the other ones sort of were like Hulkish, and then that white smooth one was very silly. This one looks the most like grounded, gritty, down to earth, sort of real, like in the way that Batman comics, you know, you sort of like think like the way people talk about Batman and that gritty, down to earth, real. You know, I don't always necessarily agree with that. I think that a lot of the ridiculousness is needed, but here it's like, I think it's drawn so perfectly, and it's not a full reveal, so we don't know what's going on down there yet. And right. I like that too. It's but so far this is my favorite.
Yeah, I think part of what I love about this golem is he legitimately looks like what if human being but made of clay. Right? Like that is because all the others it's like what if giant round human being? What if like terracotta warrior, right? It's like all these sort of weird experiences. But this one really does, like he looks, you know how R. Crumb did an illustrated version of the Book of Genesis?
Of course.
Like I could see this being his drawing of Adam when God first creates Adam out of the earth before breathing life into him and making flesh, right? It's like he really looks like a human being, but made out of clay. It's really cool.
Absolutely. It's fantastic. Great comic book right there.
Great comic book. We're now going to pick up with the conclusion of this story in Detective Comics number 632.
Yeah, this is from August 1991, The Golem of Gotham Part 2, written by Peter Milligan, penciled by Jim Aparo, inked by Mark DiCarlo, colored by Adrian Roy, lettered by John Costanza, edited by Denny O'Neil and Kelly Puckett. So same.
And as you said, our cover is just like Batman on a lamppost. Looks really cool. Lots of bats behind him. Zero to do with the story inside. Yes. All right, so we come in, and on page 1, Batman and the Golem are fighting, and as they are, we get more of that great Saul narration. And Saul reflects about the fact that he made a golem from clay, aping God, in order to protect the ghetto.
What is
because the
ape?
ghetto needs a protector.
What
Yeah.
does that mean? I aped God. I didn't understand that, and I didn't bother to
Copied,
Google it.
act like to ape something is to like copy it, right? Like,
Oh, I didn't know
right,
that
like
phrase. That sounded thing.
yeah, like if children were just watching someone and then mimicking it, you could say they aped it or whatever
Hmm.
it be. But I think obviously here it's like intentional because it's like copying God, but like clumsily. It feels like, right? It's like,
Oh,
oh,
because
I
it's like
tried
a
to do
monkey
it.
see, monkey do. That.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay,
yeah, yeah,
okay,
exactly, right. It's
got
like I
it.
aped God in this way, which I mean, it's interesting because it kind of brings up the entire what I imagine is one of the tensions around the golem, right? Like Judaism looks at human beings being in the image of God, meaning that we should have imitatio Dei, right? We should imitate God. We should be like God. They say that like, what does it mean to be in the image of God? It means to behave like God.
Right,
God is merciful, therefore you should be merciful. God
right.
seeks justice, therefore you should seek justice, et cetera, et cetera. And usually the one thing that's pointed out is like what human beings can't do is like creatio ex nihilo, right? Like creation out of nothing. That's the
Okay.
thing that God can do, but humans can't. And yet, to like create human life from a golem, it's like that's why it takes all this esoteric wisdom and Kabbalistic mystical secrets, because it's like human beings ain't supposed to do this. This is some
Right.
like
It's
God only shit, right? Like this is the kind of stuff that God can do, and we're like mimicking it. And on the one hand, it's a Kabbalistic secret, so clearly it's like you can't say it's never to be done, but there's a reason that like only the most learned Kabbalistic scholars would be able
right.
to know how to make a golem because like it's kind of an affront to creation in a
It,
certain way.
right. It's sort of the Jewish version, and maybe this trope borrows from it, but in like other fantasy things or magic stories or supernatural stuff where it's like this is dark magic, we don't touch that, don't use that book, and then the villain uses it for evil, and then the hero has to use it in order to overcome the villain, but like then puts it away or destroys it forever. You know what I mean? Like it's like a Harry Potter kind of thing. Like they go to the dark magic book section in the
Right,
library
right,
and to see
right.
something they're not supposed to, and they use it because they need to, but then like, we'll never use it again or something like that. Put it back in the box.
Yeah, I mean, I think even in the Talmud, I want to say that it's in Chagiga, but I could be wrong. Like I think even the Talmud basically says like there are some teachings that can't be done in large groups, right? There's like this whole section where it's like you can't teach this in front of like more than two people, and you can't teach this in
Mm.
front of more than one person because it's like this stuff gets dangerous, right? And like for
Whoa.
a long time, mystical teachings were considered dangerous, really. And as far as I know, which again, this is based on my both research and what I learned in rabbinical school, there's like a medieval midrash called Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer, which features Rebbe Eliezer, who's sort of a known mystic, and it essentially like he gives a lot of midrash that's not quite Kabbalistic, but leaning towards it, and his, Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer sort of like koshers or like makes it okay to talk about this stuff in a way that it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
before.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, like the whole idea of you can't study Zohar and Kabbalah until you're 40 and it shouldn't be done. Like there's definitely this sort of sense of this stuff. Like, even in the Torah, when it says like that you shouldn't suffer a witch to live or that you shouldn't practice witchcraft, like it's not saying it because it thinks it's nonsense. It's saying it because it believes that it works and it's dangerous. And so we don't touch this. So very much the idea of like, like creating a golem, everyone knows about it, but it's kind of the stuff from the part of the Jewish library that you don't touch unless you really
Mm-hmm.
know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wonder if there's been like uh maybe someone should do this. Like like after Harry Potter, there's like a billion knockoffs of kids who do stuff and magic. I wonder if there's like a Jewish version. And we have a book called the Golden Dreidel, I think, and
Hmm.
it's a fantasy book. We just got it for Hanukkah, and it's a kid's fantasy book about chapters about like a mystical like thing. That would be a fun thing. Like the Jewish day school kids or the kids at Hebrew school go into like the old library into this section that is forbidden, closed off, and they get one of these books and read accidentally the recipe for the golem, and it reeks. I don't know, like why hasn't that been done yet?
Probably just because no one has wanted to do something so explicitly Jewish in that. But like, yeah, it sounds great. I mean, you're also making me think, right? Like, this is also from Chagiga, but you know, the story of the four sages who entered the Pardes, right? Which is like sort of a euphemism for having this mystical experience. And it's Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, and Rabbi Akiva. And one dies, and then one goes insane, and one becomes an apostate and doesn't believe in Judaism anymore. And only Akiva, it says, like, went in peace and left in peace, right? So, like, that idea of the danger. But that's different than what you were describing. But, like, yeah, I love the idea of, I could see, right, these, like, middle grade yeshiva buchers that go into, or like day school kids that like discover the secret pardes in their base midrash or something like that, and then exactly as you said, like end up creating a golem. That could be really fun.
All right, this is I'm putting this pitch out there to my friend David Light, who's a writer for the zombies movies on Disney, to make something happen with a Golem kids show where
well, it's either that or you and I make a comic book together.
There you go.
But back to the comic book we're looking at. On pages 2 and 3, Saul continues thinking, because the Nazis came and those who fought, and there were many, died, and those who did not fight died many times. We get this sort of like ongoing theme now that Saul is convinced that although Jacob and the others died, the people who didn't die, like the ones who didn't fight, died over and over again, which I assume is like his guilt, his shame. It keeps coming back to him. It's like a 1,000 tiny deaths. But Saul acknowledges, but everything is going wrong. The golem does not obey me. Why must I keep dying, Jacob? Why can't someone breathe life into me? Oh, my heart is breaking for Saul. And also, like, it's gorgeous as I think of the idea of like when God creates human beings, God creates them by like breathing life into right that earth. And so, right, like, oh, like that feels to me like it's something that you could see as like yearning medieval poetry, right? Like, oh God, why can't you breathe life into me? Like, oh, there's something gorgeous about it.
I love it.
On page 5, Batman reads Emeth on the golem's forehead. And he has a reaction like he's never seen that word before, but it's maybe familiar. And I got to ask Henry once again, like in kayfabe,
right?
Is he looking at Hebrew letters or English letters?
This bothers me because in kayfabe, I think, as we discussed last episode.
And then just as a reminder also for any of our listeners who don't watch wrestling or know about it, kayfabe is like within the like protected reality of the story being told. Right. Meaning like in real life, we recognize that it doesn't really look like that. But like within this comic book, right? Like we've talked like
this is a real world within, and this is the story that's happening that's real within this story.
Right. And within the actual story, within Batman's life, is he seeing English letters or Hebrew letters? Like, is it only in English for the benefit of us reading it so that we can see what it says? Or is it in English letters for Batman also?
Right. So I think that as we established last episode, that we agreed that he is seeing Aleph Mem Tav, right?
Right.
Okay. So that, to me, I have a problem here. So I have my first nitpick in these two issues. Batman, I'm sure Batman knows Hebrew. I am positive he knows Hebrew. He probably knows dozens of languages, but I'm sure someone who probably comes across ancient texts, sees crimes that happen in churches, probably tons of synagogues, like I'm sure he knows Hebrew during one of the many years that he studied a billion languages. I'm sure Bruce Wayne. So he shouldn't be confused by it. He should be recognizing it and then recognizing that it's a golem.
And that's why, like, if he knows Hebrew language well enough to read it, then he must know what it is. Like, that's what's so confused. Like,
Right.
it feels, because my read of it is actually, I get the sense Batman doesn't know Hebrew, and that's why it's like baffling for me to imagine him seeing a language he doesn't know how to read and then being able to pronounce it. Like, I think that in the kayfabe of this, it has to be in English.
Huh. Wow. So for this particular story, it's a little different. I mean, listen, maybe Saul wrote it in English and maybe he knew that worked. I don't know. And because he's in America now, I have no idea. I mean, that would be the only explanation for why Batman doesn't understand it or is confused by it, because I cannot accept that Batman doesn't know Hebrew. Like, Superman knows like every language because he listens to all of them and probably can read a dictionary at super speed. But like, Batman has studied everything, right? It's as the Midnight Boys in The Ringer like to call it, the prep. Batman does the prep. And so I think he just must have learned Hebrew at some point. He took like ancient Phoenician at Gotham University.
Sure, and he learned like Akkadian and all these languages. But the only problem is, like, on the next page, we're going to have a moment where Batman realizes, Emeth is the Hebrew for truth. So it's just like,
right.
It just feels weird because it feels like he's surprised as he remembers that it's Hebrew. Does he know how to read every language, but he can't always remember which language it is?
Maybe.
I just know I can read it, but I can't tell you what it is.
Right. I mean, maybe because like maybe he would have used Hebrew to decipher codes and things like that. You know, maybe he knows like the alphabet, but like can't speak fluent Hebrew. Although I gotta believe Bruce Wayne has done business in Tel Aviv and stuff, and like. Right.
But again, if he speaks Hebrew, Emet's a pretty common word in Hebrew. So he should have more, like, the fact that he's like puzzled by it doesn't really work.
All right. So anyway, it doesn't, we can both agree that this part doesn't work. Totally work for us.
It doesn't work. But as he says the word Emet, the golem like pauses for a moment and actually ends up leaving. And Batman is like, do I recognize shame in his face? And I love it because I love the idea that reading it, I don't think it's just like, oh, the golem's weakness. I think it's like, what is Emet? Emet is God's seal. Emet is truth. And Emet is associated Kabbalistically with Deen, which is judgment, right? Mm-hmm. So I love the idea that because this golem has been attacking innocents rather than the people that deserve it, maybe the reminder of Emet, of truth, is what's getting the golem to be like, uh-oh, shame over what I've done.
Right.
Like, I love that. So as we said, on page 6, Batman realizes, yes, indeed, Emeth is Hebrew for truth. So page 8, we've returned to our neo-Nazis, our white supremacists. They are breaking into Saul's apartment or his home, and one of them is saying he thinks the golem is a scam. It's just a costume, and then says the old Jew is probably financing it. So we get horrible anti-Semitic tropes. The idea of like, oh yeah, it's just using his money to make us believe that. And then they keep talking like, well, maybe it's a guy in a costume, and someone else goes, so maybe we're up against a Jewish Schwarzenegger here.
What does that mean?
Like, I think it's 1991, so one of the biggest celebrities of the time is Arnold Schwarzenegger, and everyone's impressed by his body, and so like, yeah, it's a Jewish Schwarzenegger because the guy's like huge.
Right, like T2 had like just come out.
Yeah, exactly. So on page 9, and it breaks my heart, they force Saul to spray paint a swastika in his own home. When I think of the disrespect and the degradation, if a neo-Nazi made me spray paint a swastika in my like, I can't even imagine the pain that it would be for a Holocaust survivor, nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably, it's I'm surprised he doesn't mention it in his narration, but like, in the way that like the Nazis made Jews dig their own graves, and just like that complete, like you said, degradation and white supremacist power over Jews, and
it's horrific.
But again, not gratuitous here, and well written, and seems tasteful for whatever reason. It just working,
No, it's grotesque, not in that like, oh, I wish I hadn't seen it, but in that it's like, oh my God, like I'm really feeling the emotions of the story. On page 12, they've taken Saul to a Hindu temple where there's a giant golden Ganesha statue, this elephant, and Saul flashes back then remembering when the Nazis threatened to kill him unless he gave over the Jewish resistance. And Saul's upset because he's only 22 years old. What did one expect of him? Although I think last issue they said 23, but now he's 22.
Okay, whatever.
Well, the only reason I found it interesting, Henry, and I'm sure it's just a coincidence, but he did make a golem out of Sefer Yetzirah, and that involved using the alphabet, and there are 22 letters of the alphabet. So him being 22 years old feels like there's something parallel going on there. And then, so the Nazis have him captive and threaten to kill him, and he turns in the resistance and gives them the name of Jacob Sholem. That's who Jacob was, his friend that he turned in to survive it himself. And obviously, I think the name Jacob Sholem is a clear nod to Gershom Scholem. So I think Peter Milligan must have encountered some of Gershom Scholem's work on the Golem, and therefore, gives him a little nod here. On page,
do you think he came across that same book that?
I hope so.
That we talked about last issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say, it's so how did this revelation hit you, Henry? Because for me, the first time, it was a gut punch. I mean, maybe I had a sense this is what happened, but it's not that Saul was quiet as Jacob was taken away. He turned his friend in. He turned the Jewish resistance in to survive because he didn't have the strength or the courage to die himself for the sake of the larger whole, which, on the one hand, I can't blame him. And on the other hand, I can't imagine the guilt I would be living with if I knew that happened.
What do I think? I think, first of all, yes, it was a very shocking twist. We are very used to, at this point, when covering Jewish content, seeing an old Jewish man with a white beard who is just completely, where you just completely feel for him in all the ways, there's no question of his morality or anything.
Yeah.
So, and I think, you would hear stories of the Holocaust of someone who, a relative of someone who died rather than giving names up or things like that, or righteous Gentiles who certainly did that. But there are stories of people who did whatever it took to survive, and that includes this. And I think it's actually really brave of Peter Milligan to write a story like this. And again, doesn't feel sick, or doesn't feel like, oh, how dare you show that about Jewish people. It just seems like a really good story, and probably one that was more true than we've heard.
Yeah.
So anyway, I guess I got no beef with it, and I think it's really a good story, really well done, and a great twist in terms of narrative storytelling.
Yeah. I think it's
very cinematic, that reveal. It's with the flashback.
Yes,
it's beautifully done.
It makes Saul such a deep and rich character because I still I recognize the depth of the pain, and there's a part of me that is just you trash, you don't deserve.
It's horrible. You're horrified.
I'm horrified by what he did, and also would I have done the same? I have no idea. Please God, I'll never need to know what I would do in that kind of situation.
Right.
So on page 14, the Golem has come and found them, and the Golem pushes over the Ganesha statue, the giant golden elephant. Something about him pushing and the way the art is in that panel, it feels to me like Samson bringing down the pillars surrounding him, right? And
it's so also cool. Like the Golem dying on top of his master in the last episode we covered. That
yes,
image. It does kind of. I didn't like that. Another religion's deity and had to be destroyed for the purpose of the story. I didn't love that.
Yes.
Probably in 91 I wouldn't have noticed, but
right. I think honestly the biggest flaw of this comic at all is that so much of it is about their racism towards this Indian population and clearly a Hindu population. and yet we never get to know a single one of the Indian characters or any
Yeah.
how I don't know how you would do it, but like what would it look like to have a story where like we get to know one of the Indian characters
Right.
and there's maybe even an interaction between Indian rather than just like, hey, do you see how the hatred towards this population is similar to the
Right.
hatred towards Jews from Germany? Like that works, but like I still think this is like an A-level story, but the A+ version, right? If I had to find something wrong with it, it's that.
It's this and Batman not knowing his Aleph Bet.
His Aleph Bet, yes, yeah. So one of the supremacists is begging Saul to call the golem off. Saul looks down and refuses. And you just see the golem, you hear like the screams as the golem destroys him. On page 15, another one, a younger guy this time, is begging for help. He doesn't want to die. He's only 18 years old. Once again, I'm just saying, like, if Saul was 22 and it was about the Aleph Bet, there's something about 18 and high, like, it's just subtle enough there. There's like something interesting about the ages of these people. On page 16, Batman saves the kid, ties him up, and then basically says, shut up. You don't deserve saving. I loved that moment, Henry.
Classic Batman.
Loved it. That Batman does save the freaking neo-Nazi and also is like, you're a garbage human being and don't really deserve this. Like, yes, that is what my morality would say. Like, you're a human being and therefore your life matters. And also I'm disgusted by you, so don't think like I'm your friend for this.
Right. I love when Batman leaves a villain, like doesn't kill a villain, but leaves them hanging.
Yeah.
I love that because it's so like violent and vicious. It's like different than when Spidey does it, where it's sort of funny, you know?
Yeah.
But I and this is like so deserving of anyone. Like it's classic Batman torture.
You know, not with the Golem bits, but like we've covered a few different comics dealing with neo-Nazis and anti-Semitism, right? And you remember how upset we got with Captain America for being like, well, don't they have the right to protest? And don't they have the right to gather? And like even with Supergirl, she eventually got on the right page, but she also was kind of annoying with it. So to have a superhero that like looks at, and I'm not surprised it's Batman, but he sees neo-Nazis and white supremacists and is just like, shut up, you're garbage.
Right. He's like, he's not like, they have a right to their opinion.
No, not at all. Batman's like, you are trash, you are garbage. It's just the fact that you yourself have not actually done any of the murder this time that I'm saving you, right? But like, I loved it. I just go Peter Milligan, go Batman in this case. Batman and the Golem are fighting. Batman ends up kicking the Golem like right in the E from MF, and the Golem lets go, and I love it because it's like if this was an old video game, it's like the E is the weak spot that you hit, and the Golem starts flashing. Right.
It's like in Mike Tyson's Punch Out, you got to time it just at the right part to hit, to hit Mike Tyson. Yeah, there's a topical reference for you.
Yeah, it's so funny. Well, it's 1991, so it's 1991 topical.
Right.
Batman is talking to Saul on page 17 and explains that he was able to find him because Saul had painted an Asian swastika, which goes clockwise, as opposed to a Nazi swastika, which goes counterclockwise. And Batman took it as a hint that, like, oh, Asian swastika, I should go to the Hindu temple. And Saul is like, I just couldn't bring myself to draw the actual Nazi swastika. And I was lucky that these guys were so ignorant that they didn't know the difference, which also, like, love that dig at these white supremacists that don't even really know what the symbol is.
Right. Like they don't even know their own symbol. You know, I've heard other stories like this, but I had an encounter with that particular symbol where it's not a swastika. So at Indiana University, where I went to college, in the old rec center, so they built a nice new one, but the other one was still open. I forget what it was called, but in some of the walls and like stairwells, there was tile that had that symbol. And it's weird, like when you walk in and see it, but it's not the swastika. It's so I don't know if it's still there, if they just got rid of it after a while or tore down the building, but it was, I didn't go there very often, but it was always very jarring when I saw it. So I love that Batman used that as a clue. He's like even smarter than Saul gives him credit for. I just didn't want to draw an actual swastika, Batman.
Well, but what's crazy is the fact that that is where they took him, right? So like there's a cool moment here of it's almost like divine coincidence that Batman solves it, and that does end up being the right place. Because like they could have taken him anywhere else that was not this elephant graveyard, that was not the Hindu temple, right?
Right.
There's something cool about that. So now Batman is asking Saul, like, you need to call the golem off. And friggin' Saul responds and says, my golem has been imprisoned, has been denied for over 50 years. Now it is beyond control, beyond caring, beyond forgiveness. Is this him describing that he can't just, like, it's so interesting, the idea that, like, because what he's suggesting now is not just that this is a second attempt at making a golem, but this is the same golem he tried to create.
Right.
And he's been waiting 50 years to make this golem, and therefore this golem is filled with 50 years of shame and rage and regret and horror. And that's why he's suggesting, like, normally you can control a golem. I can't. This guy, like, is he just saying the golem is out of his control? Or is he kind of being like, no, my vengeance has not been quenched. Like, I still want the golem to destroy people.
Until you just said that last thing, I really just thought the latter.
I think it might even be a little bit of both.
Might be. I mean, clearly, if you haven't picked up on it by now, what he's saying is basically the golem is me, like, is filled with a part of me, and all of this rage and pain and shame, and that it's 50 years of me bottled up inside this golem. So now it's just that it's all, that's what it is. It's those emotions in clay monster form. And so you can't control something like that at a certain point, right? Like once the genie's been let out of the bottle with those kind of, so I think that that's what he's saying. I don't think he's like, no, I'm not gonna, I just don't want to, like he did, like, before, with the,
I mean, we'll see what happens, because like as the story progresses, I get the sense that he is kind of like, yeah, I'm not gonna stop him. I'm gonna let him go. At the very least, he's saying, I'm not gonna stop him. Because on page 18.
Wait, but it's so great that Batman's like, yeah, I had a feeling you might say something like that. Like, I love when Batman is a little witty.
Yeah.
It's always unexpected. You always expect him to be so serious, and then he'll have a quip here or there.
Right. So on page 18, as Batman continues fighting the golem, we see Batman trying to erase the E so that it says met. And Saul warns the golem. He doesn't want this is what I mean, Henry. These are the things where it's like, it's not just that he's saying it's not stoppable. He's like trying to protect the golem.
Okay. All right.
Again, the golem is kind of him, right?
Yeah.
But then there's a weird thing that gets said here where Saul says that only the golem's creator can kill him. And I did not get a chance to look into this. I had not found anything, like, there are the different stories, right? There's the version where you write God's name on a piece of paper and put it in the golem's mouth, and when you take that piece of paper out, the golem goes to sleep or doesn't live anymore. There's the version where the word Emmett's written on its forehead and you erase the Aleph and that's what kills it. I've never heard the idea that the only one who can erase the Aleph is the golem's master. I don't know if Pete Milligan is inventing that, or if he found like one version of the story we just haven't encountered.
Yeah, I mean, because we've seen everything. We've seen the golem accidentally wiping it himself. We've seen it. Well, either way, it's fine. It's a good. It sort of makes sense with the. It's not like it's not. It's not golem accurate. Like it can make sense. Like, the one who creates is the only one who can take away life. Kind of thing.
There's something interesting.
Yeah, that's fine.
As they keep fighting and Batman kind of ties up the golem against the Ganesha statue, on page 20, we get a bit more of Milligan's unique approach to the golem mythology by introducing, we didn't talk about it earlier, but there were a couple times when the golem was grabbing Batman and Batman felt like the breath was really sweet and kind of made him want to go to sleep, like it was soporific. And here Saul comments directly and lets us know that this golem's breath makes people go to sleep. It sends them to sleep. And he comments, a curious idiosyncrasy of this golem. That's how I spent my life, sleeping the sleep of the guilty, scared to wake up to the truth. But now let others sleep. Really interesting, this idea that, like, I was asleep to the injustice. I was sleepwalking through life, and now that I'm awake, others, it's their turn to sleep. I just thought like I'd never encountered anything about the golem's breath being sweet or the golem's breath making you fall asleep, but it's a cool twist here. Like I like it because it works on the literary level.
What do you think? Well, I'll let you, because in the next, well, maybe I'll just read it. In the next panel. He says, I betrayed Jacob, gave him the Nazis to save myself, to stop them from hurting me. It's happening again, but this time I'm fighting back. Batman has a very specific kind of reaction where it looks like he's almost like Two-Face. Like half of his face is horrified and half of its face is full of anger. Is that how you read Batman's reaction here? Because of course he gets physical with Saul, but is he like, oh my God, what have you done? Or is he like, you're next, buddy, and or a little bit of both?
It's hard to say. I want to answer this after we finish it because of what happens next, if that's okay.
All right.
So as you described, Batman has this horrible face, and he basically threatens Saul, and he threatens to to horribly abuse Saul. Like basically it is echoing the threats that the Nazis gave to him in that moment, right? If you don't turn on your friend, if you don't turn him in, I'm gonna end you.
Yeah.
And
like he says, let alone an old sack of bones like you.
Right. And it's kind of horrifying. And Saul then, afraid of pain, perhaps, erases the E because he's been threatened on page 21. And Batman calls out in his own narration, in his own diary, as you described, Batman calls out that he was threatening Saul the same way the Nazis did. And it kind of grosses me out to think of Batman making a comparison to the Nazis in this case and like forcing this man to relive his tragedy, right? Like if the Nazis once forced Saul to turn in his friend, and now Batman's threatening Saul, and then Saul erases the golem, which is he basically talks to the golem like it's Jacob or like it's himself, right? Like we see that he makes the same decisions of prioritizing. Like there's a way in which it's terrifying that this man, has kind of realized like the golem is just a power fantasy. It's just a fantasy. It's not like really changing anything. He's still the same. I don't know. There's something so painful.
Yeah, but like, do you think Batman is just? To me, Batman here is being honest with himself and is pointing out his own flaw in that I just did. Or is he just saying, or is he just giving an analyzation? Like, is he saying, if I'd have time, I would have persuaded him, but I didn't have time. He had to kill his golem. There's only room for one golem in this town. So is Batman at first like making a judgment on himself about how he was acting, but then by the end of it is rationalizing his actions because he's Batman and he has to protect Gotham City? So
it feels like that, especially because on page 22, on the last page, Batman lifts Saul up and comments that he feels lighter, which I guess the implication is he's been eased of his burden now. And Batman like apologizes to Saul and is like, I wasn't really going to hurt you. Like I just said what I had to. And like, there's something in that apology that like kind of strikes me like when a rage addict yells and then is like, well, I wouldn't really mean it. I wasn't really right. And like, that's why it goes back to what you were saying of what is Batman's face. Cause it's like either the face is genuinely Batman snapping into a rage at like, this golem is killing innocents. And because you're still caught up on an injustice from 50 years ago, you refuse to do something when you have the power to stop him. I'm disgusted by you. Like, is that what's going on? Or is it Batman realizing I'm not going to get this guy to do what I need him to do unless he's worried? So is Batman like dramatically pretending to be angry to motivate Saul and get him to erase the E/Olive? And so, I don't know. I want it to be Batman, the master planner, acting this way to scare him, and it was all part of a plan to know what would take it out, because I really hate the idea that Batman lost his cool and then threatened this man in the way that he'd been threatened in the past. I hate that version.
Yeah, I think I do too, by the way. I kind of can't believe that Batman would have really hurt this guy.
Yeah.
I think that I gotta believe that that Batman that Batman would have stopped himself at some point, and maybe he's not, maybe he wouldn't what do you call it? Maybe he wouldn't have, I don't think Batman would have actually hurt him. And I think maybe he was full of rage and sort of getting to that point. And so I think it was something a little more than just trying to act scary in order to get him to do what he wanted, in order to get Saul to do what Batman wanted him to do. But I don't think he would have gotten to the point of actually hurting him in any way. I think he would have just scared him enough until he did it, like is what happened. Or he would have taken his hand and forced him to erase it. And I think Batman's way of saying that is, I'm sorry I scared you. And actually, gotta hand it to Batman for apologizing to an old man that he scared. Like, since when does he could just hit the smoke pellet and be gone, right? Obviously, he's going to take him to the hospital. Batman
Reading it this way, he's a very menschy Batman, right? And then, the wonderful thing is the last panels are like that young neo-Nazi still hanging, and Batman just being like, I honestly forgot you were even there, right? And just like leaving him hanging, as you said. And there's just like this wonderful, like, you've chosen hate. Fun. Yeah, you've chosen hate. You'll get taken down eventually. I don't care about you, but like, you get the sense that he's maybe gonna like take care of Jacob or of Saul, sorry, and like maybe build a relationship there.
I could see Batman getting Saul to the hospital, obviously alerting Commissioner Gordon that there's a bunch of neo-Nazis, tied up in this Indian temple. And then I could imagine Bruce Wayne doing two things. One, writing a big fat check to this temple to get, or have a Ganesh that's delivered, from across the seas to their temple, and reaching out to someone that he knows as Bruce Wayne to help Saul, a doctor that he knows to talk to him, or like the nice Jewish lady that he knows. I could see the epilogue being something like that.
Yeah. Well, that's our two-parter. Like, really rich. I found I really liked reading these issues, but I think I just found talking this through with you, like, I suddenly like the issues even more after the conversation we just had.
I do too. I really love these. I mean, it felt like the end of a really satisfying Batman the Animated Series episode.
Sure.
And I feel like this could have been an episode. I mean, the Clayface episodes are some of the best of the animated series. And so I totally could imagine a two-part or even just a one-part night. X-Men 97 is all the rage right now. I would love to see a Batman the Animated Series that, could pick up and do stuff like this. But I really love these two issues so much. These are like some of my favorite comics I've ever read. Like top 10 Batman comics for me.
Wow, that's great. That's really exciting. Yeah, it's Peter Milligan. The guy's good.
He's really good.
Yeah.
All right, Brandon, I have a question for you I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
It's okay.
It's your exit question. No. Okay. So I don't think you and I have ever talked about like belief in God and stuff like that on the podcast, and we don't have to, and I'm not interested in that. But do you in any way, any part of you believe that any aspect of the Golem is true, like actually happened, that something in it, inexplicable, unexplained happened, in any of those iterations, not in the comics, I'm saying like Sefer Yetzirah, anything like that, the legends of the Golem? Do you think it's that anything is true? Like, do you
No.
believe in? No. Okay.
No, not a single bit of it.
Yeah.
It's funny because I was sitting there thinking, and I was like, yeah, like, do I ever? And it's like, because it's funny, right? Like, when it comes, as you're saying, we don't need to get into belief in God, but I often tell people, and maybe I am getting into it now. I sometimes think belief is the wrong word,
Right.
right? Like I think of the experience of God because I've had moments in my life when I've experienced God and I've experienced Hashem and I've had moments, and
Right.
sometimes that's a good experience and sometimes it's a bad experience. But I'm in the year 2024. I have degrees. I know, I'm not a science major, but like I know some science. Like I understand rationally and logically why it's like the idea of believing in God is such a weird thing. But I've like experienced God. And so what do you do when you experience something, right? It's like
Right.
belief just feels like the wrong word. That being said, like I love Torah and I love thinking of Torah as this like mystical text that is not just the words of human, but is capturing a divine experience and it has some divinity and specialness to it such that you can interpret it in these beautiful ways, et cetera, right? The golem is not Torah. The golem to me
Right.
is Jewish mythology, which is very different. Mythology is like inherently like, it's like it's mythos, it's folklore. Like it's always struck me as like stories that are told and are cool and are like, oh, here's a fun thing in Judaism, but it's never struck me as having any grounding whatsoever in reality.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I agree. I think I'm kind of like Mulder and Scully. Like I want to believe,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
uh, and obviously it's like a ridiculous question because it's like, well, what do if you were to believe in something, what do you believe more, that like these stories in the Torah actually happened, or that like a rabbi created a monster out of clay? And for some reason, that maybe it's just because I'm a comic book
Yeah.
person,
Yeah.
seems more real. It's sort of like how I don't think that like there are vampires in the world, but I kind of wish that, like, I kind of want there to be. Like
Yeah.
that would just be
Yeah.
kind of cool if there were. That's kind of how I feel about the golem. But
Well, it's funny because you asked me, right? Like, do I believe in the golem? And part of or any sense of it, and part of me is like, probably not the golem. Dybbuk, maybe. Like, I'd
yeah,
be more inclined to accept a Dybbuk than a golem,
okay,
right? Like, there's
okay,
something there. And yeah, like, clearly agree. There's like this part that's like, I want the world to be like a little bit more magical and have some of this cool
yeah,
stuff. And
yeah,
there's, right? Like, we referenced in the last golem episode, but the idea that they were like demons that studied Torah when hanging out with the rabbis sometimes. I'm like, I like that's so like, of course, I want that to be real, even though like
right.
probably demons don't exist and or maybe they're just like a psychological way of understanding like some cruel aspect of humanity, right? So
Well,
the goal of
maybe this
yeah
was like the best example of that, Brandon, and that that this golem sort of was created out of Saul's own horrific past, and so
yeah
maybe yeah, that like the metaphor, the allegory, whatever is right there. That like maybe that obviously the golem is created not out of necessity, but like the fiction of it even may have helped people.
it's
That like,
exactly what I think you described earlier, that it's a power fantasy, right?
mhm,
Like the usage of the golem story is it usually is rooted in times that the Jewish community was notoriously weak or lacking in the power to fight back against oppressors. And so the golem becomes this narrative of like, what if our like Torah and belief in God could actually turn into a protector who
mhm,
would like have these abilities to help out? And like, the story, I'm less interested in golem stories when they evolve into just like the miraculous and fun tales of the golem of the Maharal of Prague. Like, but like the idea of the golem as protector, there's a lot of power in that, right?
right,
I
right,
think it's exactly as you said, there's a lot of comfort in the idea that we can create our own protector. And then there's a lot of savvy understanding of humanity when like the protector that we make turns out to be flawed and unable to stay on task and winds up just turning into this like vengeance monster.
right.
Right? Vengeance is it's not a good thing, no matter how much we want it at certain times.
Yeah, I guess. I
Yeah.
only we had more golem stuff. If only we had more golem stories to cover.
Well, I have both good and bad news for you, Henry.
Oh?
We do.
Oh.
And we will be covering them next time on the 30th episode of Funny They Don't Look Jewish. But until we get there, I'm Brandon Bernstein.
I'm Henry Bernstein.
No relation.
Thanks for listening. You can follow us at Jewish Comics Pod on Facebook and Twitter, or you can email us at jewishcomicspodcast@gmail.com. Please don't forget to give us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, and you can hit the subscribe button if you haven't already.